Kia ora koutou, thanks so much for coming along today. My name is Matthew Galloway, and I want to start, before we get into the talk, just by thanking Golriz for hosting this, and especially for your care and criticality and interest in this topic. Golriz and I have talked together on this issue in a number of different settings. And so when she brought up this idea that we could host something in Parliament, I think, I felt it was a really important thing to do for a number of reasons. And one in particular, I think, is just the symbolism of bringing this issue to the space, because I do feel like it's an issue that just does not get talked about enough. I also just want to mihi to Kamal Fadal, Mohammed Slayman Labat, and Albara Jailali, who are three of my Sahrawi friends who have all contributed to this talk in different ways. And I think as I've been putting this talk together over the last few weeks, they've really been on my mind, because really, a lot of this is their story, and I kind of feel like I'm just a kind of ordinary, everyday New Zealander coming to give their message. I want to start with this rock, which is maybe weird because it's kind of just floating in space, but it's important to start here because this rock has kind of found itself unwittingly at the center of the crisis I want to visualize today. This rock is a phosphate rock mined from the disputed territory of Western Sahara. Phosphorus is an essential part of life. It's a building block of life, and it's kind of an essential element of enabling bone growth, DNA and RNA. And of particular importance to our talk this evening, when processed into superphosphate fertilizer, it becomes an element needed to promote plant growth. In fact, New Zealand fertilizer companies have claimed that this phosphate fertilizer helps to grow our food to a point where if we got rid of it, our annual production would drop by up to 50%. However, unlike other elements that are vital to life, like oxygen or nitrogen, phosphate is a non-renewable resource that takes millions of years to form. And yet, we burn through millions of metric tons of it a year in the form of phosphate fertilizers. So there's this real paradox to this rock and to this element. It's life-giving, and yet it's quite scarce, and it plays this vital role in our food systems that often feels overlooked or hidden. So we're going to zoom out from this rock now and put it inside a different context. It's April 9th, 2022, before sunrise on Otago Harbour. A large nondescript bulk carrier, the Stony Stream, enters our frame. This boat, the Stony Stream, is arriving to Port Otago carrying the last of its cargo, raw powdered Western Saharan phosphate rock, purchased by New Zealand fertilizer company Ravensdown, directly from Moroccan state-owned phosphate company OCP. The Stony Stream docked at Port Otago for 3 days, unloading phosphate via onboard cranes. You can actually see the phosphate blowing away on the wind as it's unloading onto the waiting trucks. The Stony Stream is one of 2 shipments brought in by Ravensdown in 2022, totaling approximately 100,000 tonnes of Western Saharan phosphate. And if we zoom out further, we can begin to trace the path of this ship. Before coming to Port Otago, it stopped at Lyttelton and Napier, the 2 other Ravensdown ports. And perhaps even more notable is the fact that Balance Agri-Nutrients, which is the other major fertilizer company in New Zealand, brought in 5 shipments in 2022 to its bases in Tauranga and Bluff. For decades now, these shipments and others like them have accounted for about 90% of our yearly phosphate imports, making us here incredibly reliant on a single source of this very vital resource. Using 2022 shipping data, we can isolate the path taken by the Stony Stream and other ships like it. Below much of the more highly used routes that you can see, we can see a much fainter line. that's moving across the Pacific toward the southern tip of South America. This graph here, even though it's abstracted, shows the total tonnage of phosphate rock exported internationally from Western Sahara in 2022. The New Zealand imports are in white, showing how significant our stake is in this international trade. And this graph shows the consistency of our involvement in the trade over the past decade, averaging over 400,000 tonnes a year, with the blue blocks you can see being Balance and the green being Ravensdown. I also want to point out that the fact that we are even following this route is due to an easier and cheaper way to get from New Zealand to Western Sahara, which is through South Africa, has actually been blocked. And this is because in 2018, one Balance boat named the Cherry Blossom was halted in South Africa by the Supreme Court there and labelled to be carrying stolen goods. And it's upon tracing back here to this place on the near opposite side of the world that our story becomes increasingly complex. Western Sahara is an indigenous land of the Sahrawi who have practiced a cyclic nomadic lifestyle on this land for hundreds of years. And this way of living involves a deep understanding of the desert, how to use its features, and how to move through it in a manner that responds to the seasonal climate changes that we have. But the territory fell under Spanish colonial rule in the later stages of the 19th century. And then Western Sahara has been classified as a non-self-governing territory since 1975, at the time when Spain opted to end its rule. But in the direct aftermath of Spain's decision to leave, neighbouring Morocco invaded the territory, going against an International Court of Justice ruling declaring the right for Sahrawi to have a vote of self-determination. In the wake of this initial invasion from the north, the occupying forces began constructing what is now the longest fortified sand berm in the world, carving off 2/3 of the territory for Morocco. This wall now makes it impossible for many Sahrawi to access their homeland. During the original 1975 invasion, a large portion of Sahrawi population were forced to flee for their lives, leading to the establishment of the refugee camps located in neighbouring Algeria. This remains the longest standing refugee crisis in the world. And although there's been talks and there was even a peace agreement reached in 1991 due to the promise of a vote for self-determination for Sahrawi, Morocco has consistently blocked attempts to make this vote happen. Meanwhile, within the Moroccan-controlled territory, the longest conveyor belt in the world has been installed to bring raw phosphate to Port Leone from Moroccan-controlled Bokra mine. So we have the longest conveyor belt, the longest fortified sand wall, and the longest refugee crisis. And each in their different ways plays a part in defining how this crisis has played out. I first want to focus on the berm. This is a direct and violent artifact of the Moroccan occupation. This berm has been continually fortified and patrolled with the express purpose of making it impossible for Sahrawi to get back into Western Sahara. And what you can't see in these images is the carpet of landmines that are buried on the eastern side of this wall. UN data recorded over 1,000 deaths from these landmines, and despite efforts since 2008, they've only been able to clear like maybe half of the mines that are buried along the wall. This berm also represents perhaps, I think, the most brazen physical evidence of Morocco's illegal status within the territory. Earlier I mentioned the 1975 International Court of Justice ruling concerning the sovereignty of the territory. This ruling is really important, and it has three main points that are worth sharing. The first is that it ruled that the Sahrawi have a long-standing history of inhabitants of the territory. It also found that neither Morocco or Mauritania down to the south have any sovereignty ties to the region. And then finally, it recommends that the decolonisation process of the territory should proceed with Sahrawi getting the chance to exercise their right for self-determination. Despite all of this, though, 2 weeks after this ruling in 1975, Morocco invaded the territory. Secondly, and as a direct result of the boom, we have the establishment and protraction of the Sahrawi refugee camps. These camps, in these camps, over 170,000 Sahrawi live in incredibly harsh conditions, living primarily on international food aid and enduring summer temperatures that are upon some of the hottest that we see anywhere in the world. This is the point of view of my camera as I'm walking through the camps in 2016. I was there as part of an annual arts and human rights meeting. And as part of this meeting, we were kind of billeted out with the local people and stayed with families and were able to experience everyday life with them. About a week into my stay, there were these heavy rain warnings that came through, and you can see like these kind of crazy clouds coming on the horizon, and some of the members of the family I was staying with visibly kind of worried and starting to prepare for what might come. And I think what's important about this and why I wanted to share it is that it gives us a sense of the precarity of their situation in the camps, because all of the buildings you can see are built mainly of mud bricks, and these bricks just melt the minute that there's heavy rain. And I think a year before this photo, the previous kind of raining season, there was a rain that was kind of so bad that it literally wiped out half of the kind of the shelters and homes that they have built for themselves in this kind of in this place that they've had to establish over a number of years now. And while I was in the camps, I also got a chance to interview Al-Bara Jalali, who's the matriarch of the family I was staying with. I think her story is important to share as an example of what Sahrawi have had to face. She was 8 years old when Morocco invaded Western Sahara, and they killed her mother. She was forced to flee with her father and her younger siblings to Algeria. She said goodbye to her two older brothers, who went to join the resistance and fight in the conflict, and both of them died, so she never saw them again. And I think when I think about Al-Bara and her story and what she kind of relayed to me, the things that really stick with me is that despite all of this and despite a very, very long time living in these camps and the promises being broke about the idea of a vote for self-determination or peace talks not really doing what they said they were going to do, she remained like incredibly hopeful and had an amazing resilience and felt very convicted in the idea that she wasn't going anywhere, that her people weren't going anywhere, that establishing themselves in this place so close to the border of a territory that is their homeland and that they can't step foot in felt like resistance. I think it's also interesting to note that she dedicated her life as an adult to setting up early childhood programs for generations of children that have come through the camps and only known the camps, never known life outside of them. I think while I was there, I was also incredibly struck by just how hard it is to grow anything, the lack of greenery. In the camps, Sahrawi, as I said, have been incredibly reliant on international food aid, and because of this, they get hardly anything fresh in their diet. And I think, to me, this caused me to reflect on, the stark contrast that exists there between the ultra-productive pastures and abundant food production of New Zealand. And I think particularly when you think about the fact that such a crucial element to our food production is so connected with this place. And that brings us to kind of like the third intervention into this landscape that in some way shapes this situation, which is the phosphate conveyor belt. 100 kilometres long. If we were to get in a car right now and start driving, we'd get past Levin before we reach the end of this conveyor belt. You can see it from incredibly high up on satellites because the prevailing southwest wind blows a certain amount of phosphate onto the landscape, staining it white. And I think what else is interesting is if we were to take this this mine and place it over the top of Wellington, the bottommost tip of it would be at Island Bay, and the top would be at like Lower Hutt or the start of Upper Hutt. Like, it's huge. It's really hard to really fully understand the scale of this thing. But this is a time lapse of the mine from 1984 to 2021. So the time while it's been under Moroccan control. And I think what we're witnessing by watching this time lapse is, I guess, like the entrenchment of Moroccan activities in the region. Its ability to continually add infrastructure and to expand and to profit off of this occupation. This entrenchment through infrastructure has been well documented actually as one of the ways in which Morocco is able to really further assert its dominance in the territory. And I think through this time lapse, we're also witnessing an absence. It's an absence of resource. It's the marks left by extraction. When we think about this from a Sahrawi perspective, these are the marks of loss. They're the loss of control over natural resource, the loss of the ability to profit from it in the future, and like the loss of the ability to even decide for themselves whether they want to extract it or how they want to use it in the first place. In an interview I conducted with Sahrawi artist Mohammed Slayman Labat, he shares his father's memories of being a child living nomadically on the land before Moroccan invasion. And I just wanted to share a few of his words with you now. Sahrawi understanding of space is not based on economic perspectives. It's based on a relationship with the space that you live in and the memories and the poetry that comes with it. For nomads, it's not about simply traveling from place A to B. The whole process unfolds through the knowledge related to place, the belief, time, and experience that goes with it. It's it's much deeper than let's set up a border and you belong here. It's a way of life. These lines of extraction also represent what has landed in New Zealand shores as a result of this trade relationship with Morocco, which has occupied militarized earth, taken from one place to enrich another. We're going to get a little bit technical now, but I think it's important because it helps us to kind of fully understand what's happening here from an international law and community point of view, I think. In 2002, UN legal counsel Hans Corell wrote an important legal opinion regarding the legality of oil exploration in Western Sahara by foreign oil companies. This opinion is highly relevant here today because it's relevant to the question of phosphate rock as it deals directly with the question of extraction of natural resources from Western Sahara. The opinion makes it clear that, per UN guidelines for non-self-governing territories, any resource extraction must be for the benefit of people of the territory, in line with their wishes and with the view of helping them achieve self-determination. In his summary of findings, Corell states that any activity that disregards the interests and wishes of the people of Western Sahara violates international law. So I think we can pause here and I don't know about you all, but to me, this idea of disregard, I kind of can't think of anything that could represent disregard of the interests and wishes of the people of Western Sahara more than a military occupation, a fortified berm, and the longest refugee crisis in the world. And yet, over the years, Corral's opinion has actually been used by the New Zealand fertiliser industry to justify this trade. The most recent example of this can be found in the Balanced Agri-Nutrients 2022 annual report. Under the title Sustainable Sourcing, there is mention of an external assessment by consultancy group named Te Herenga for the Fertilisers Association of New Zealand, validating OCP's operations in Western Sahara against UN criteria. Tracing back to the Fertiliser Association website, we find a section related to activities in Western Sahara, and this PDF under a tab named Responsible Sourcing. The document states that Fertiliser Association member companies have adopted UN guidelines around worker rights when addressing the working conditions at the likes of OCP in Western Sahara. This is the latest in a long line of examples where the companies imply good working standards as an example of Corral's call for the trade to benefit local people. But the reality is, any Sahrawi still in the occupied zone face violence for showing any signs of Western Saharan nationalism, and OCP predominantly employs Moroccan settlers as a way to further entrench their occupation. With documents like this, the fertiliser industry are happy to reference certain UN guidelines when it suits them, while at the same time they are happy to ignore more foundational UN principles like the basic human rights for self-determination, which of course is being broken by OCP's very presence in the territory. Digging further into the Fertiliser Association website, there is also a section on Western Sahara, and specifically the Corral opinion is actually listed as further reading to support their position. This talk, I think, what I've tried to do is visualize the violence, the stuff we don't see very often, or not at all, because it's on the opposite side of the world, and unless you kind of know what you're looking for, it's hard to find sometimes. But we've tried to visualize the violence of the fortified wall. We've visualized the violence of the extraction without consent. But to me, this is also a kind of visualization of violence, because I think we're actually surfacing a different kind of violence here. It's the violence of making this all seem legitimate. In fact, to me, it takes a certain amount of mental gymnastics to just process the way these companies have employed consultancies, which happen to, by the way, include, and within the consultancy, they employ an ex-Human Rights Commissioner of New Zealand on their payroll. They've employed these consultancies to figure out ways to use UN guidelines to justify a trade and an occupation that the UN has consistently called illegal. I even find that after poring over these documents and thinking about this situation and being involved in it in different ways for years now, it numbs me, the way that they do this. And I have to keep reminding myself that actually this is quite simple, and it's spelled out by Corral and it's spelled out by a lot of other people. The idea is, if there's no self-determination, there can be no benefit. Because the only way that there can be benefit is if it's determined by the people. The Sahrawi are the only ones who can say whether or not this trade is benefiting them. And in particular, what benefits the Sahrawi can definitely not be decided by an occupying force, and it certainly can't be decided by a group of New Zealand fertiliser companies and their PR consultants. I think it's also worth noting that Hans Corral himself saw this happening and went out of his way to make a statement. He saw his words getting twisted, so in 2008 he released this statement. It seems that the opinion that I shared has been well understood by most, and many concerned have drawn appropriate conclusions. However, there are those who have construed it differently from its meaning. In some cases, the interpretation bears clear evidence of a very special underlying interest. I think what these documents ultimately do is they perpetuate the status quo. They allow this to just kind of keep rolling on, keep happening. They make our involvement in the trade seem okay. And they also limit the potency of institutions like the International Court of Justice and the UN. And I think the erosion that allows is something we should all really, really care about. I mean, we're seeing it right now with other conflicts like what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. The minute that it seems okay for people to ignore rulings from a International Court of Justice or from the UN or whoever it is, it seems more permissible for the next person to do it. And also, these documents and the way that this trade is being talked about by our companies is ultimately lending New Zealand's legitimacy as this good moral actor on the world stage to the trade. If we do it, it makes other people think they can do it. It makes it look legitimate. And I think what else saddens me is this tactic really works on farmers. The farmers who are the end users of this phosphate, and farmers who have a whole heap of things going on and a lot of pressures, a lot of things that are kind of being directed their way and telling them that they're wrong about in terms of how they're conducting their practices. And in this case, the farmers I've talked to about this issue have either never heard about it, they don't know about it at all, or they're shocked at how bad it is because of the ways that the fertiliser companies have been portraying it to them, which I think tantamounts to lying to them. It's putting another thing at their door and asking them to have to deal with it, and I think that's incredibly unfair on the part of both the fertiliser companies and actually, I think the New Zealand government as well, because our farmers, our food production, it's our economy, so we're all implicated in this, and I think this is where I feel like the New Zealand government has to step up and step in. Successive governments have been incredibly silent on this issue. And to be honest, they seem pretty happy to just go along with the same PR spin that the farmers are being told. It seems very easy for the government to just look the other way. But my big question here today is to ask, why are we continuing to ignore the situation? But I also want to challenge the government to think about what it would mean to actually regulate this trade in some way. What does it mean to actually hold these companies to account? What would it take to actually tell them to get out of Western Sahara? Because I think, to my mind, there's other things that could happen that make us stop. I think, are we just going to wait until the conflict over there gets worse or gets unpalatable, like even more unpalatable than the situation already is? Or will it take another boat or two, getting caught up somewhere around the world because it's got stolen goods on it? Again, at what point does the damage to New Zealand's reputation matter? Because it doesn't seem like it does in this case. And I think on top of all of these immediate pressures, there's also the slow burning issue of phosphate as an increasingly scarce and finite resource. This image should make us all feel quite uncomfortable, I think. Because we're living in a world where a very unstable geopolitical crisis is deeply wedded to our ability to produce food in New Zealand. And Morocco here, this is the latest reporting on who's got phosphate reserves. And Morocco holds a staggering amount of it. The other thing that's interesting about this image is we don't know at what point Morocco is Morocco and Morocco is Western Sahara. They're not telling us how much phosphate exists in both territories. So we have no idea what it would look like for the Sahrawi to have control over those resources, and whether Morocco's just simply whittling them away before they even start to look at their own. And phosphate scarcity is also linked to our food security. And And this exists beyond the Moroccan issue, I think. Here we have the verticality of the present. This is right now. And this is 1900 and our steep rise in the use of fertilizer around the world over that time. And then this is all the different estimates of when we're going to reach peak phosphate. And I guess like my takeaway from this graph is no one really knows. But even some of the more the better estimates, it's only 2080, so like it's still only 55-ish years away or something. So yeah, at that point, when we start to reach this idea of peak phosphate, our supply chain gets even more problematic. And the thing about peak phosphate is that we've already set a precedent for it. Our agricultural history would not be possible without the complete exploitation and exhaustion of two Pacific Island nations. Nauru had huge amounts of phosphate mined under occupation by British and Japanese. And when independence was finally achieved, the nation was left locked into this extractive economy. And this resource was completely exhausted by 2005. And Banaba, located within the island chain of Kiribati, was also mined to exhaustion throughout the first half of the 1900s, resulting in a rehousing of an entire population. The fact is that the very nature of phosphate is that it's lithic, it's of the earth. And I think where there's extraction, there's always going to be some kind of like geopolitics and environmental consequences involved. We've looked at a lot of territory of Western Sahara via satellite today, but this is a different view. It's also Western Sahara territory, but it's a close-up of a photo I took a few days after that Stony Stream boat arrived at Port Otago. And I was biking to work around the harbour, and this warehouse that I knew was used by Ravensdown to store phosphate was literally overflowing. I want to end with this image because it's the view that I saw out of my window for about 8 years when I lived on Otago Harbour, opposite the Ravensdown factory. And it was because we lived there that I first kind of learned about these ships, because I'd see them coming and going. And I wondered what they'd bring us. And I knew it was a Ravensdown factory. I knew what Ravensdown did. I knew about fertilizer. And so I started to make these connections and trace these ships back to Western Sahara. And after going to the camps and coming home, this image became like a reminder to me, because I would wake up in the morning and the chimney would be going. And I'd close the curtains at night and the chimney would still be going. And there's just this like endless nature to this production and how much we're reliant on, all of these things to produce the amount of food that we do in this country. It's like this constant conveyor of supply and demand. When I was in the camps, the theme of the meeting I was there for was after the future. And the idea of it was in 2016, it had been 25 years since the peace talks and since the promise of a vote for self-determination that's never happened. And so there was a whole generation, 20 to 25-year-old Sahrawi from the camps, who had lived with this promise dangled in front of them for their whole lives. And the idea of after the future was the idea of reckoning with the idea of whether that future was ever going to come. And when I was there, the sense I got from that theme and from the talks was that there was a real frustration starting to build amongst that population, especially the younger generation around this. And so it came as no surprise to me that a few years later in 2020, the peace was shattered. There's been since then a bunch of different conflicts along the berm between Moroccan forces and Sahrawi resistance. And so in the process of that happening, activists here in New Zealand and around the world fighting against and trying to visualise this crisis have started to call this mineral blood phosphate, because it's directly linked to an ongoing conflict now. And just to end, I think, with this idea of the endlessness of it, it's important to note that as we zoom out from Otago again and see Aotearoa bring in the shipping patterns again, there's actually another boat on its way. It's called the Sea Faith, and it's a balanced boat, and it's due to arrive here, I think, around the 6th of May. And so I guess I'll end by saying and questioning how many more boats have to come. How long do we keep this going, and at what point, and where is the place that we can turn to start to see some change in this situation? Thank you. So I think now we were gonna, Golriz, do you want to say some words? And then we can have questions maybe if people want.
Inga mana, inga reo, inga karangatanga maha, tēnā koutou katoa. This thing is really high. It is blood phosphate, right? As uncomfortable as that is, and as much as that challenges our understanding of who we are as the little peaceful green island in the bottom of the South Pacific, we are addicted to an exploitative form of agriculture that has meant that we've sold our values for the profits of these mega phosphate companies. I come to this issue as a refugee from a place with another non-renewable resource that the world is very addicted to, crude oil, and Iran being where I was born, as a human rights lawyer with a previous life focus on international law and those institutions, and as a Green. And this is the meeting point of all of those, both lived and other experiences for me. So to say that there's generations of Indigenous Western Saharans living in a refugee camp is to say that there are generations of people who are suffering mental health harm, who are not able to live freely in terms of going to university, deciding what they want to do, creating art, traveling, doing all of the things that we do. And I always want us to focus on the fact that when we talk about refugees, we are talking about human beings who have the same hopes and dreams and values as us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. They are not, and it does feel like that when you're in a place like Iran or Western Sahara or anywhere else that the world for generations accepts lives with violence. It feels like the world sees us as being a predetermined part of our lives as being stuck in displacement. Like it's okay for it to happen to us because we were born into that. And it's not. We feel it. These guys feel it in that camp. They have exactly the same expectations of their rights, understanding of democracy, of self-determination, all of the same hopes and dreams as we all do. So that's what's at stake in terms of human values. In terms of international law, we are a small island nation. We, of all the types of nation states out there, should be scared when court hearings happen at the International Court of Justice, rulings come out of that, and other countries ignore them. If a country makes it onto the United Nations decolonization list, that is a massive deal. And we are bound as good international citizens to not only abide by that ruling and by that definition, but to actively facilitate it, because we want to live in a peaceful world that is ruled by those multilateral international rules-based orders. We need that. We're not a big superpower. We need cooperation and respect of international rule of law more than anyone. We can't afford to set this precedent. And so when we look at what that might look like in terms of, and I totally agree, it's exactly like the Ukraine and Russia thing. We passed law in this House within days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine to sanction individual leaders, including their funders, including their trading partners and corporates, because we recognised, as did our friends and allies, that we can't stand for that in an international rules-based order, that it is a threat to peace everywhere. Now, for us to suddenly start buying Ukrainian grain from Russia would very clearly be New Zealand contributing, incentivising that occupation and that war, right? Like, that's why we passed that law. Because war for profit incentivises war, incentivises occupation. That's not a world we want to live in. And then if we look at it as a green little country with an absolute interest in climate justice, do we really want to say that all of our human values, our democratic values, our international laws that we abide by, are not worth this non-renewable resource that's burning the planet? Because that kind of agriculture does. And I should, at this point, acknowledge my green colleagues, Te Aotearoa, who's our ag spokesperson, and Janie Sage, who's a former Minister for Conservation. These are conservation issues that come together, and my Labour Party colleagues as well who are here. So whichever way you look at it, it's all wrong. But I do want to say that there is a government-based solution. And when I called last term, on the Select Committee for Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, wild that those things seem to be intrinsically linked in this House: trade, foreign affairs, and defence. Trade rules. But when we got the ministry in to tell us why New Zealand is still buying Western Saharan phosphate from Morocco, what they cited as the reason they were comfortable, this is our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so a government entity, was the private legal advice that Ray Windown had got. So we're just relying on a corporate body funding a legal opinion to form government policy. Imagine if we did that in any other context where New Zealand is expected, a corporate body, to abide by the rule of law, by human rights, by our environmental obligations. Or the company says it's legal. And that is not acceptable. And actually, other nations agree that it's not acceptable. Australia has divested from this phosphate. So we can do it. We just have to agree that our values, workers' rights being one of them, but certainly the value of self-determination, the human rights of Western Saharans, the mana of a United Nations body that says we have to help decolonize, the rule of law in international arenas with the International Court of Justice, is more important than our intensified form of agriculture that's burning the planet. Because the government does have an obligation to protect those values, and it absolutely can. So that's what we're pushing for here. We're pushing for our values to be prioritised over corporate profit, and a recognition that infinite growth and consumption and waste can't exist on a finite planet. Kia ora.
We can open for a couple of questions. I don't know, there might not be any, but if there are.
Tēnā koe, Matthew. Thank you for all of the research that you've done, pulling it all together and very eloquently talking about the intersection, as Golriz did, between our agricultural industry and the exploitation in Western Sahara. Eugenie Sage, Environment Spokesperson for the Greens. We've got a policy of phasing out synthetic fertiliser use because of the huge damage nutrient pollution is doing, and you've highlighted all of the other reasons to phase it out. In terms of the South African court and that court case around it being stolen goods, which stopped the vessel transit, do you think there's any capability to do a similar legal action here in the same way that lawyers for climate action have taken legal action to highlight the need to reduce our emissions?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I think the idea of activism and I guess doing some of those more kind of grassroots ideas of challenging things. I know that some of the groups I've been involved in have questioned this idea of literally calling the police when a boat arrives. And I guess the question about some of those bigger legal things is, getting funding or getting the pro bono work to do something like that. But I think there's definitely a precedent for that, because I think they would also like to go through the Panama Canal, and for similar reasons and concerns they haven't been able to do that for a while either.
And second question, obviously we'll continue to push here, but any good alliances with environmental NGOs like Greenpeace, which is also pushing to phase out synthetic fertiliser, just to spread the message a bit more about where we're getting our phosphate from, because I think you're totally right, a lot of farmers don't realise that, a lot of New Zealanders don't realise. We're more familiar with Nauru, but not just the human rights abuses, the refugees, and just the exploitation of Western Sahara.
Yeah, definitely, and I mean that's the point of this talk and the work we're trying to do, is to bring more visualisation and centre this issue for sure.
Kia ora, Angela Roberts, Listing P with Labour, and Deputy Chair of the Primary Production Select Committee. So I'm really curious, Eugenie just talked about building alliances and having allies, and it's farmers who own those. They're not just big multinationals, we've got cooperatives.
Yep.
And I'm curious, when you you've had an opportunity to talk to farmers, where you've managed to do that and how, and where, the obvious gatekeepers are obvious, right? But if there's some opportunities for us, I can already think of some ways of doing it, but I'm curious to hear your experience.
100%. I mean, a lot of my experience comes from family as well. So, my in-laws are dairy farmers down in the Waitaki Valley, and they're really involved and interested in bringing more kind of visualization to this and attention to this topic as well. And I think one thing we've talked about is, bringing this talk to the farmers, trying to get that happening, because as you say, the idea in New Zealand of us being within the fertiliser industry based on these co-ops is it's been harder for the likes of Western Sahara Resource Watch, which is an international watchdog for this issue, to actually find ways to pressure the companies to stop. So overseas, a lot of the companies involved more traditionally are based on shareholder approval and investment, and so they've had to divest because it's been ethically proven, so dire that no one wants to invest in companies that are involved in the trade, and so that pressure has caused companies to change what they do. But in New Zealand, from that perspective, we'd need the farmers to agree together that they're not happy with what their cooperatives are doing on behalf of them. And I think that's why we have this crazy PR spin from the companies, because I think, it's in their interest to try and keep these narratives, at bay. So I don't know. Maybe I just need to do a tour of the country. And well, I've talked to the board of Ravensdown, I've been in the room with the board of Ravensdown, and I think one of the messages there was, well, what's your appetite for how long this might take to change, in terms of it might take. We can't just switch the tap overnight, in terms of our systems or whatever. And I said to them, we could be having this conversation now, and if you'd actually been making progress on this, you could be switching the tap off, If you start now, in a year's time, 2 years' time, you can come to us and say, yeah, we're changing. So the fact is, it's not about, it's about the inaction on their behalf.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, learned a lot. Thank you so much. And I've been so impressed with how you stayed with us for a long time, because I know when you began to get interested, and you've just continued to follow it through. I was going to ask you if you'd received any pushback, so you've sort of talked about that a little bit. Do you get a sense that if you keep pushing, they'll become aggressive, the likes of the fertiliser producers? Do you think it could get nasty?
I don't know. I'm like an optimistic person, so I don't feel like it would, but I mean, who knows? I think from being in that room with Ravensdown, I get the sense that these are people, right? Like I think on a personal level, what I came away thinking is, like, on a personal level, I don't think any of them were happy with this idea that they were involved in this trade. But then on a company level, it was like a whole different thing. Like, it was just like the disconnect there was incredible and pretty depressing, to be honest. But I don't know. I feel like, without getting into it too much, I do feel like Ravensdown do not seem happy that they're in there, and I would like to see some action from them on that. Balance is another deal. They've been pretty bullish about their involvement. But, yeah.
Hi, I used to work for Federated Farmers, which is very interesting to be here. Partly to the room and partly to you, is the resource on the Chatham Rise considered as an alternative?
Well, I think the Chatham Rise is interesting. I'm not... Chatham Rock Phosphate is a venture, so off the coast of New Zealand, deep sea mining of a phosphate deposit there. And I think, I've made the point in the past when I've been asked about this, that it really illustrates how happy we are to take phosphate to mine from the other side of the world and not have to see the damage, right? Compared to the idea of actually thinking, let's dig up our own seabed. Let's do it close to home. And so that's another question about how we see ourselves and what we're willing to, permit to be able to continue to do what we currently need to do with the systems we have in place. Yeah.
Can I ask, in the short term, given in the long term we need to support farmers to shift to a more sustainable way of growing food, but in the short term there are alternatives to Western Sahara.
Yeah.
Are they simply more expensive?
Yeah, so they're more expensive. I know, for instance, my family has decided to use other sources, and they've just paid more for them. But what that talks to as well is who's paying for this phosphate. It's the Sahrawi. Like, they're paying the price for cheap phosphate for us. That's what's making us profitable. So again, it's kind of disturbing to think about it like that.
I'm interested in the great talk, by the way. Yeah, thanks for having us. But I'm interested in the alternatives. Like, what are people potentially looking to change to? It doesn't sound like phosphate of any description is really a good long-term solution. Yeah,
totally. I think there's a number of issues there. Like, this talk, originally we had the ambition to be part one, like about Western Sahara, and then a second part about this idea of what are the solutions. And it just became, it was like so big we'll have to do it in 2 parts. But there's a number of issues there. One is the phosphate cycle is broken by human activity. So when phosphate is put onto grass, it grows it goes into the grass, it goes into, let's say, the cow, it goes into the milk, it goes into us. It travels through a cycle of kind of, a cycle of, trying to think of the right word. Let's just call it a cycle. But it doesn't go away. Like, it doesn't get used up. It actually stays in these systems. And so what happens is, after it's in us, it gets excreted out and flushed out to sea. And so we're literally kind of breaking the cycle by just like getting rid of this valuable resource. And so one thing that we've been researching and looking into is, actually, again, like so many things, actually ancient ideas and like indigenous ideas around, manures and, like reusing human excrement to get phosphate back out of it. Like, these are things that we just don't do because, we've built all these industrial systems so we don't have to. But in the process, we've, just kept digging up this rock that's, taken millions and millions of years to form, and it won't be there forever. So, Oh, yeah.
Got a slightly left field question for you, so I may be unfair, I don't know, but do you think there's any chance that and I know we discussed this a couple of weeks ago as well, but George Monbiot keeps talking about precision-based fermentation and the massive impact it could have on industrial farming. Do you think there's any possibility that some of these problems, not that it's a reason to say, this isn't, we don't have to worry about it, because technology is going to solve it, but do you think there's a possibility that precision-based fermentation could shake up farming enough in the medium term that some of these problems about phosphate start to wane?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. You might have done more reading about it than me. Like, I've done some, and I think I got really excited about it at the start. I thought, like, this sounds incredible, the idea that we can grow food in laboratories and cut out a lot of the inefficiencies in the process. But I've read other research that talks about the amount of carbon and energy that's still required to do that. And so it's hard. I can't speak to it more than that. And I also, I guess, this idea of phosphate being like one of the building blocks of life, like phosphate is still part of that process. But I don't know enough about that technology really. Cool. All right, well, thanks again everyone for coming. It's really nice to see you all, and for responding to the invitation. We can continue to chat on the side about it as well. All right, thanks.